Stephen, if you'd like to take a seat. Stephen, thank you for joining us to talk about your most recent book, Southern Africa, Old Treacheries and New Deceits. In the book, you refer to the ANC as a repository of faith. How has ANC dominance been weakened, or as some have argued, symbolically strengthened, by Zuma's ousting of Mbeki?
In some ways, it's been strengthened. It's very, very curious. Mbeki appealed to such a narrow section of the ANC. He obviously appealed to a very large number of the exiles who went and fought for independence and majority rule from the outside. But even within that group, to those who were very, very intellectual, to those who'd been affected by the outside world sufficiently so they bought into the whole neoliberal global vision. And the interesting thing was that because he was very much attached to the exile base, and because he spent so much of his life outside South Africa, in fact, by the time Mbeki came back to South Africa, he might as well have been a foreigner. He'd spent so much of his life outside of the country. Zuma had also spent life outside of the country, but he'd also spent time not only inside, but inside prisons. He was on Robben Island. He had that kind of internal pedigree, so that even though he was cut off from the bulk of the population, he was able to say that he was a South African pure and proper. And he certainly wasn't an intellectual. So he was in many ways able to bind the disparate wings of the party, of the internal party, much more successfully than Mbeki was. So yes, I would say that the ANC is a much more unified party now than during Mbeki's day.
You recount the time you spent observing elections in Zimbabwe, including your own calculation of results. What are the prospects for next year's polls in light of clear jostling to succeed Robert Mugabe from within Zanu-PF?
That's if Robert Mugabe is even alive by the time the next year's polls come around. It's almost like a death watch right now, not only on the part of his opponents, but even of those within his own party. And if he does campaign, and if he does win, for how much longer would he hold office in any case? To a certain extent, the elections are almost a sideshow. Now, what might happen is that you may not have unified elections. In other words, it may not be a vote for both Parliament and the President simultaneously. It could just be one or the other. And I would say probably, if they're going to do just one, it would be a presidential vote. This would leave aside the need to rig on as comprehensive and as complex a basis as last time. It would make the choice quite straightforward. It would also make forcing the issue, as it were, quite straightforward. Now, having said that, I think that the surrounding region has got a very great deal of interest in ensuring that these particular elections are held in as honest a fashion as possible. And even if they are, I think there are some, as it were, precautionary anticipations which the West should have. There's no guarantee that even in a completely honest election that Robert Mugabe would lose. He could win an honest election. I don't think that is going to be the case. I think that if there is an honest election, Morgan Tsvangirai would win. But I don't think it's a completely foregone conclusion. In other words, having a clean and fair election could pose a huge number of imponderables in the future. A lot would, of course, depend on whether it's just a straight two-horse race. What if someone like Simba Makoni re-enters the race, or somebody like him? Don't forget that although we all lamented the fact that Robert Mugabe stole votes from Morgan Tsvangirai last time around, he also stole a great number of votes from Simba Makoni. What happens if a third party divides the vote? Who picks up the stray votes? What's the variable in a wild card, a wild horse, entering the stakes apart from the big two? So my prediction is that there's probably going to be an election for just the presidency. Even if it is free and fair, there's no guarantee who would win. If there's a third party entering the hustings, then all bets are off.
You spent a good deal of time with Morgan Tsvangirai, and your book provides a very clear picture of the man. How will history judge him?
I think history is going to judge him in a number of ways which are not totally flattering. The flattering parts of the judgment will certainly be that Here is a man of immense courage. There's absolutely no doubt about that. He stood up, he answered the call, he didn't back down, he tried his very, very best. I think history will certainly accord him integrity. Having said that, I think that history is also highly likely to judge him as a tragic figure. Someone who was called to do something for which he was not prepared, for which he had insufficient capacity, and for which his allies were also ill-prepared to help him. He's taken a very, very long time to make the transition from a noble opposition leader to a competent prime minister. One of the test cases, of course, of how good you are as a prime minister is how you use your parliamentary majority to aid and abet the kinds of policies that you would like to implement, how you would use parliament in which you have this majority to seek to outflank Robert Mugabe and the Zanu-PF party. And Tsvangirai has failed dismally to do that. He's used parliament hardly at all. Parliament hardly meets at all. So he's got all of these advantages he has not taken advantage of. He's tried to meet Mugabe on his own ground, almost taking the part not so much of a prime minister, but of a dissident deputy president. That's not what the dispensation called upon him to do. And one of the great faults of Morgan Tsvangirai is his strategic approach to policy. He can't keep a straight line, but is always chopping and changing, often according to the last bit of advice he heard. Now, having said that, there are very, very real signs in the last 9 or 10 months that he is learning, but this has come quite late in the day. He's begun to impress outside presidents within the SADC grouping. They're now taking him much more seriously and are viewing him as much more of a class act than he was before. But even so, his performance within still gives rise to all kinds of concerns. Basically, if Morgan Tsvangirai did not have 10 diabetes, the MDC would be a busted flush right now.
Your book also spends a great deal of time analysing Thabo Mbeki's complex character and the role he played in Zimbabwe's power-sharing negotiations. Are contemporary judgments of the man unfair?
Yes, I think so. I don't think anyone, Thabo Mbeki or otherwise, could have done very, very much more in the Zimbabwean case. The South Africans took a very, very sanguine, pragmatic, and I think a necessary view that you can't dictate another country's policies. You can't regime change. You can't regime change even in your own backyard. You've got to work with the people who, in one way or another, attracted a fair amount of electoral support. And I think that's something that both sides of the great argument in Zimbabwe could claim, that they had electoral support to one extent or another. The exact final nature of that support is contentious, because it's quite clear in the case of Zanu-PF, they stole the magic margin. That's not to say they didn't have core support. So what Thabo Mbeki was faced with was trying to find some room for parties who both had a degree of electoral support. They both had constituency. Now, when you've got that kind of situation, you can't simply relegate one side to the sidelines. You've got to try to deal with both. And particularly if you want to have some kind of peaceful administration, when one side has a very great monopoly of military and other security force, and the other side does not, you've got to try to work for some kind of inclusive package. Now, having said that, I think Mbeki tried to fashion his inclusive package to the greater advantage of Zanu-PF than of the MDC. I think he was mindful of the shortcomings of Morgan Tsvangirai and thought there would be a safer pair of hands in Robert Mugabe and in the hands of Robert Mugabe's lieutenants. I think this is a fundamental misjudgment. I think that there should have been a genuinely equal power share. The principle of power share I don't object to, given the circumstances. The way it was done, I think, does call into question all kinds of things that you want to ask of Thabo Mbeki. But I do think that history will judge more kindly than many Western commentators who else and what else could have been done.
Opposition politics in South Africa take place both outside but also within the ANC. For example, General Secretary of COSATU Vavi's strident criticism of Jacob Zuma's government. Where, if anywhere, is there place for opposition to the government?
I actually don't see significant opposition to the government. I certainly don't see it from the Democratic Alliance. I think the Democratic Alliance is going to play the necessary parliamentary opposition so that there is, as it were, an institutionalized form of protest and dissent within Parliament. But within the ANC, I really don't see COSATU, I don't really see the SACP playing a major dissident role. There'll be differences of opinion. There'll be major differences of policy emphasis. If anything, what you've got is a very, very curious set of maneuvers within the ANC whereby no one part of it plays an internal opposition, but it's a constant moving feast. And because of that, different factions simultaneously try to use the wild young men of the party, so that people like Julius Malema is not often speaking simply for himself, but is sort of like the hired gun or the loudmouth who is speaking for other sections within the ANC to test the waters. So in that sense, what you've got is a sort of internal dissent within the ANC that is conscious of its audience ratings. No one really actually knows what the audience rating for certain policies might be. No one actually knows what the satisfaction quotient definitively is in South Africa. So everybody's playing a game, trying to test water, trying to see which waters will allow certain factions at certain times to gain major public support, not only in terms of policy, but also in the succession stakes. Who's going to come after Jacob Zuma, particularly if he does honor his original word to be a one-term president?
The third country, Southern Africa, Old Treacheries and New Deceits focuses on, although to a lesser extent, is Zambia. How do you read their upcoming elections?
The interesting thing about Zambia and his elections is that ever since the overthrow of Kenneth Kaunda in 1991, and with the advent of the MMD government, the Movement for Multi-Party Democracy government, what you've had are several splinter groups leaving the MMD. So what you have is not so much an MMD government with opposition parties. You actually have many MMD parties. And the result of this is that there are almost no policy differences among the different variants of the MMD, even though they're all called by different names. All of them have the same platform at the very beginning, and they've taken that kind of platform with them. There are almost no policy differences. There's no policy debate as such within Zambia. So what you've got are party politics that are based on personalities. Now, the great difficulty about this is that personalities, different personages, will seek to attract sectional support. They can't attract, as it were, support on the basis of their policy, because their policies don't differ from that of the ruling party. Sectional support could well appeal to the very, very variegated ethnic base within Zambia, almost 80 different ethnic groups in that country. And what you've got is the possibility of at least 3 major sectional divides in that country. The north against everybody else, the north and the center against the south, and some form of loose coalition between north-south or south-central or whatever. Now, having said that, I don't think that is going to happen. And even if it does happen, it doesn't mean the kind of ethnic politics or the kinds of violence that you have in a country, say, like Kenya. And that is not the Zambian history. But I do think there's every chance of a further victory for the ruling MMD party.
Stephen Chan, thank you very much.